society. Not that I'm trying to pinch members from the Heritage Foundation. We are brother societies. And our speaker is a distinguished and well-known academic in the areas that you see, author and academic on the areas that you see in front of you, and you're most encouraged to buy any of these books, cash only, I'm afraid. And then the other thing is there will be a similar talk to this one on the 19th of January?
23rd of January.
23rd of January.
At the Georgian Group in Fitzroy Square, around the corner.
If you'd like to hear it again, or if there's any else already heard it. Well, I think that's it from me. In terms of welcome also to those online, I think what we'll do when it comes to the discussion stage, we'll start the discussion in the room, and when we've made some progress with that, we'll turn to colleagues online. So if you are online, you'd like to ask a question, don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to you in the end. So there we are. So I think we just have to welcome our speaker. Invite him to give his presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, the title is The Grand Tour in the Ottoman Empire, Power, Pleasure and Scholarship, or Power, Pleasure and Ruins is another title. And the main driving force was this passion for classical remains, which also took people to Italy. And the Grand Tour was, in theory, a period of 2 or 3 years, mainly for young gentlemen. But I do have some ladies at the end, I'm very proud to say. And a lot of people carried on to the Ottoman Empire as a natural course of events. No. It stopped. Anyway, hopefully you can get it to move.
Will you try pressing the down button?
The down button.
Otherwise, I don't know what to suggest. Except you should point it at the computer. The computer's what senses it.
There's a moment. You feel that it's clear that there's something.
So that was this would be the down button. Oh, something happened.
Which bit is on?
Is the PowerPoint working here, really?
Oh dear.
Have you tried this?
It was working.
It just worked a moment.
5 minutes earlier. Anyway, power, pleasure and scholarship.
That's what button did you press?
Maybe we can try this again, but we may have to use the
And here you have the Ottoman Empire in all its glory, and you see how close Italy is to the Ottoman Empire. When there wasn't a war on, people would sail on from Venice or Naples perfectly naturally to Istanbul, Athens, Alexandria, Beirut, Iskenderun, and go to Aleppo. And the view, Istanbul, it was so alluring that people would say, heaven itself gasps in envy. Nothing in the world can compare to it. There are many panoramas of Istanbul which you will see at these exhibitions now on. And I've counted about 20 that I know, and I'm sure there are more. The jewel in the ring of the universe, it was called. And here is another panorama, which is in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, by an artist who's finally been identified, Jan van der Steen, who then went on to Bengal. I mean, he's lived many years in Istanbul and then travelled on with English travellers to Bengal. And here is another view, and here is a view of Beşiktaş, probably by Jan van der Steen, done with the Swedish ambassador Beşiktaş up the Bosphorus with the Sultan's kayak on the right. A panorama, Barca, about 1818. And I'm now going to show you a selection of book title pages, just to show how many people were traveling to the Ottoman Empire and
Recording stopped.
writing about it. And you went to your consul or ambassador in Istanbul, and he, after paying money, he would provide you with a pass that you showed to Ottoman authorities wherever you went. I'll show you a picture of one later. So it's quite a normal day-to-day event. Here is Blount, which should be reprinted. It's very, very vivid. You see, by way of Venice, it's just a normal add-on to your trip to Italy. Here is Thévenot, painted by Philippe de Champagne. It's just with a London art dealer. All these pictures are coming through London the whole time. And he also wrote in 1679, Relation d'un voyage fait au Levant. Also very readable, very vivid. He did actually go there. It's not invented. The French Grand Tour on the Levant is just as powerful as the English. For some reason, Venetians, despite all their contacts with the Levant, didn't write so much about it, and when they did write, it's much more conventional and less individual than English and French accounts. And people here is Louis XIV being admired by the four continents. On the left is Africa and Asia, I think. On the right is America, you don't see that. And people often ask me, why are you interested in French history and Middle Eastern history? What is the link? Well, the link is French power. They're so connected to each other. The French-Ottoman alliance really goes on from the 1520s with one gap to 1914. And you can't quite understand French trade and grand strategy without the Ottoman alliance, which Louis XIV in particular was keen on preserving. And he would say things like, oh, of course, I'm devoted to the interests of the Catholic Church, but it's in the interests of the Catholic Church that the Ottoman Empire should attack Vienna and the Holy Roman Empire. How he explained that, I have no idea. The complete hypocrisy. But really, the only thing that mattered was that France and the Ottoman Empire were both anti-Austria or later
Recording in progress.
anti-Russia. And one of the best French accounts of the Ottoman Empire is by the Chevalier d'Arvieux, who is French consul almost everywhere. Tripoli, Tunis, and Aleppo. His account of Aleppo is brilliant. He knew all these languages, or says he did, Arabic, Turkish, and Italian. And he also knew Versailles, because he had a job as a query to the governess of the children of France. So he's making travel the journey quite often between Paris and Versailles and Aleppo and Istanbul. And maybe that was more common than we imagine, and he would make Louis XIV's mistress, Madame de Montespan, scream with laughter when he is talking about marriage customs in the Ottoman Empire. And I mean, that should be reprinted, really, or extracts should be reprinted. It's extremely vivid, and you get the impression that a city like Aleppo is a vast, very complicated mechanical clock with hundreds of pieces, and each piece affects the workings of the other. And if the clock's working, it's all fantastic, but if the clock breaks down, and he said, most trouble to him in his job as consul in Aleppo, it wasn't the Janissaries, it wasn't the local authorities, it was the squabbles between the different Catholic orders, the Franciscans versus the Carmelites versus the Jesuits, and so on. Here is another, Cornelis Le Bruyne, who is in fact Flemish, published in 1725, but in fact it was first published earlier, another great travel book. Tavernier, who is in fact a jeweler, printed in Paris in 1692, but he had to leave France as he was a Protestant. A very famous book in its time. And here is by a botanist. There were also people not only looking for classical antiquity, but also people looking for plants constantly since the 1570s. In fact, the first description of coffee in a Western language is by somebody who is looking for medicinal plants in the Ottoman Empire. And Piton de Tournefort is a very famous French botanist, and later there is Sibthorpe, who did Flora Greca and brought plants back to Kew. And here is a picture now in Athens, very generously loaned by France. In Athens, it shows the French ambassador, Monsieur le Marquis de Nointel, ambassador of Louis XIV, and he is in front of the Ottoman city of Athens. Then you can see various mosques and minarets, the undamaged Parthenon before the Venetian-Turkish War, and he's with a huge escort of grooms and so on. And nobody knows the name of the artist. It is a mystery. This is 1674. And here is some of his loot, because of course he brought back antiquities. If you went around the Ottoman Empire, you got antiquities. There's a flourishing trade from the 16th century. And these are now in the Louvre. This was an exhibition in the Louvre. And in fact, he's going around the Ottoman Empire, he says, to show the Fermans, the latest treaty between Louis XIV and the Sultan, establishing the rights of French travelers, pilgrims, and priests. But in fact, he may just have decided that he wanted to go around the Ottoman Empire and made the king pay for his own journey, because the king was very angry about it. And here is a picture which has only just been discovered, like a lot of these pictures. And it shows the French ambassador, who is on the right in full French dress, on his horse. Normally, in theory, Christians weren't allowed to ride horses. He's in front of the old city of Jerusalem. This is 1674. It was hidden behind a plaster wall in a Paris house. It was discovered in 2018. And if you go to Oscar de la Renta, Rue de Marignan, off the Champs-Élysées on the first floor, that is where the picture is. It can't be moved because it's sort of glued to the wall. And it's an amazing discovery. You see the janissaries with their headgear. Those are the ambassador's grooms. That's his brother in red. And there's a whole sort of gang of people taking the opportunity to travel with him. And he goes to the Greek islands, he goes to, I don't think he goes to Egypt, he goes to Aleppo, and wherever he goes, there's an amazing description of his entry into Aleppo, acclaimed by the local Christians, as if the French ambassador is practically the equal in status of the local governor already. And wherever he's going, they're already encouraging this interesting group of people, the Greek Catholics, who are Greek Orthodox, who acknowledge the supremacy of the Pope. And here is a map of the travels of Ambrosio Bembo, 1671. He's the nephew of the Venetian consul in Aleppo, and he takes the opportunity to go overland to India. And a lot of, as the English spread their power in India, a lot more take that opportunity to go overland via Aleppo or via Egypt to India. And he wrote a very full account of his travels, but I find it slightly dry compared to Avia or others. And he had with him an artist, Monsieur Grelot, who here shows the entry of the consul into Aleppo. You see, escorted by Ottoman troops. It's all quite sort of a harmonious system, or so it seems. and a lot of money, of course, exchanged hands, but the troops are there to show the people of Aleppo that the consuls and travellers are under the protection of the Sultan and the Ottoman authorities. And here is one of the first views of Aleppo, 1674. The citadel is still there, but who knows how much of the city is. And this passion for classical antiquity, believing that it improved your soul, it improved your mind, it was a model of behavior. And one of the great discoveries from Aleppo, and one of the great objects of travel later, is the unbelievably magnificent city of Palmyra. And here is the first view of Palmyra, done by travellers from Aleppo, by a local artist called G. Hofstede van Essen in 1693. Our first travellers were 1678, and later it really becomes quite accessible, as we'll see. And travellers weren't only from England and France, there were also this time when Charles XII, King of Sweden, is living in the Ottoman Empire from 1709, his defeat in Ukraine. The current war in Ukraine is a very, very old war that's been going on for a very long time. Ukrainian struggle for independence and the struggle for this particular strategic area. The Ottomans supported Sweden and Ukraine, led by Mazepa. When Charles XII flees the Ottoman Empire with his officers, he sends some of them to travel around the Ottoman Empire. And here is a drawing by an Ottoman officer, I think it's Luce, Cornelius Luce, of a pyramid. And what people say is when there's no war on, when there's no crisis, it really is quite easy for travellers to go inside a mosque in the Ottoman Empire. And here is an interior view of Hagia Sophia by Luce, 1710. Some people say it was more easy than in some Catholic churches. And I imagine you paid your guides well, I'm sure. And there were even views by travellers, I don't think it's been written about really, of Mecca itself, of the Kaaba, maybe done for Muslim pilgrims from Egypt as a memento of their Hajj. It's not really certain, but you certainly get the impression there were artists all over the Ottoman Empire recording these incredible places. This is donated by Michael Enneman in 1714, now in Uppsala University. And the great Jean-Baptiste Van Moor, about whom I hope everybody knows, the great artist of Istanbul, 1698 to 1737. He paints almost everybody. This is the entry of the Venetian Bailo in 1725, Signor Gritti. It's in the Musée de Pera, you can see it there. And please note the number of people following the Bailo on horseback. Some of them will be diplomats, but some of them will be travellers swelling his train or using his protection. And a lot of Venetians are still going to the Ottoman Empire. And guess who went 1743? Casanova, who does leave an account. And here is another ambassador, 1724, and this is the French ambassador. And again, please note on the left and right, the very large number, maybe 50 Frenchmen, either local merchants or travellers, going to, at least to Istanbul, and the braver ones would go on to classical sites, Athens, the Greek islands, and Aleppo, and Baalbek. And at the moment there is an exhibition at the National Gallery about Lyotard, who is in Istanbul 1738 to 1742. He really is part of the Grand Tour because this is his route. He leaves Rome, goes via Sicily, and via the islands of Greece up to Constantinople, and then an overland route through Moldavia to Vienna. And who's paying for his journey? Who is he with? He's with some English milords on the Grand Tour who've met him in Rome, I think, and either in Rome or Naples or Venice you could find their dragomans, and for a certain sum a day, usually Greeks or local Christians who spoke Italian and French and Turkish and multi-language, you had a contract for, say, 40 Maria Theresa thalers a day or something like that, and they would guarantee your journey to fix everything and to get you back. And on the whole, it worked very well. And here is Lord William Ponsonby, later Lord Bessborough, went all over the Ottoman Empire with some friends. He employed Lyotard, though this is by Napton, who's an English artist back in London. He would have brought glamorous Ottoman dress back to London. I don't think he would have had permission to wear a turban or Ottoman dress in the Ottoman Empire. But of course you bought something for fancy dress parties in London and to be painted. And he and his friend Lord Sandwich, who is here, founded the first Levant Club in London in 1742, and I'm now looking for a quote. He wrote about it. Yes, Lord Sandwich here, who is later First Lord of the Admiralty. He's touring the Ottoman Empire in his case because he's interested in the power and the Mediterranean and naval power. And he writes of Turks, their piety towards the Creator, the exact observance of the laws of their religion, the obedience to the commands of the sovereign, that's what they really like, the hierarchy, the power of the Sultan, no nonsense about parliaments or the rights of the people, the respect to their superiors, their charity towards all distressed persons, their sobriety, no drunks in the street, or of course there were in Beirut, I'm sure, but nowhere else. That moderation, their unexampled integrity in trade, and the gravity and solidity which they express in all their actions are virtues which are seldom wanting in the Ottoman Empire. That's his account of his voyage. And he employed Lyotard to draw for them. And here, here is perhaps the best portrait of all by Lyotard, of the Reverend Richard Pocock, and that's Richard Pocock's book on the right. And he's wearing the dress of local Christians, which have to be dark blue or brown or black. And it's the only Lyotard drawing with a landscape in the background, I think I'm right in saying. Now I'm just looking for yes. And Pocock wrote about the Ottoman Empire, a wonderful book which should be republished in an abbreviated version. He goes everywhere over Syria, and I will find it. Anyway, he says it was very easy traveling in Syria and Damascus, and that he goes to inside the mosques. He spent his time sitting in cafes, nobody bothered him, And he apologizes for writing about Baalbek, the magnificent temple in Lebanon, because it's so familiar to everybody. He's doing it, doing something that everybody else has done. And Baalbek is more familiar and more described, yes. The Damascenes are much addicted to pleasure. They love to pass their time in a lazy and indolent manner. I spend my time very agreeably in Damascus, in the coffee houses, and commonly taking my repasts in them. I happened to be in Constantinople at the time when the Turk was in good humor. This is 1739. They just won a war against Austria and Russia. Yes, and recovered Belgrade. They just made a very honorable peace for themselves. I went freely all over Constantinople and was so far from being affronted in the least that I rather met with civility in every place, entered publicly into such of the mosques as I desired to see, and sometimes even on Fridays, just before the service began, and when the women were coming into the mosques to hear the harangas, the preachers. So it's a very interesting observation that women were going to mosques in Istanbul, which I don't think they did in Arab countries. And I think there will be a publication, because he ended up as a bishop in Ireland. And here is Lyotard. You see, the Grand Tour is influencing Europe, not just through the antiquities and the knowledge of the Ottoman Empire, but also through manners and customs. The first cafes in Paris and London come from Smyrna and Istanbul, maybe through Levantines rather than travellers. Lyotard is adopting a beard and a Christian bonnet from the Ottoman Empire. You see, he's known as Le Peintre Turc. And here is an example, which you see in the exhibition in the National Gallery now. A lady, the Countess of Northampton, she is dressing really after a Lyotard drawing or print in Turkish costume. And this trade, Hayden Williams, who is here, knows all about. Lots of trade, lots of presents. Travellers had to bring presents with them. Here is a clock made for the Ottoman market, recently sold in London. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. There were not just clocks, there were boxes, there were pistols. The latest technological advance was always welcome if you're travelling in the Ottoman Empire. And here is an example of a traveller's firman, which you needed before travelling. And it's the one issued to Chateaubriand in 1806 when he's travelling all around the Ottoman Empire. And it says, the traveller shall in no way be molested during his journey, and no taxes are to be extracted from him. And he's allowed to go to Jerusalem and Egypt and to have armed men at his own expense escorting him. And he went with two French servants. And eventually, some servants' accounts have been found. And here is one of the famous Turkish embroidered bags, which you often kept your travel pass in, and frequently bought as souvenirs of Istanbul. So there's just been a wonderful exhibition of these embroidered souvenirs, which are often embroidered with your name or with an inscription like "Pour mon ami" or something like that. They're in Omar Koch's collection. This is 1727 now in the Rijksmuseum. And here is a view from 1751. The great Scottish architect James Stewart is in Athens, later called Athenian Stewart, and these are his drawings of the Erection. He's sent there by the Society of Dilettanti, which still exists, and he publishes the Antiquities of Athens, which have a huge influence on English and Scottish architecture. He's drawing in the right, dressed as a local Christian. There are two Ottoman soldiers observing what's happening in the middle. His servants are digging, and because they want to observe to check that no treasure is discovered and not declared to them. I mean, there's a whole market in Athens and elsewhere for finding things, buying things, taking them back. Elgin is just an extreme example, an extreme and horrific example of a very common habit. Here is the Arch of Hadrian in Athens, 1751, done by James Stewart. And here is a very famous picture by Gavin Hamilton, painted in Rome, of Robert Wood and James Dawkins discovering, it had already been rediscovered from the west, Palmyra, 1758. The trip, James Dawkins, financed by the slave properties that his father owned. They're dressed as Romans because the theory was that Britain was the new Palmyra. It was surrounded by the sea as Palmyra was by the desert. And people were really quite obsessed with Palmyra. This is a drawing by the Italian draftsman of Palmyra, the colonnade which no longer now exists, Giovanni Battista Borra. These are all in the Royal Institute of British Architects. And here is the largest single temple in the Roman Empire, the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek. There's not so many columns now because there's been earthquakes. You see the immense care taken to draw and record, I think completely accurately, these unbelievable remains. And here is a view of the river Meander and Güzelhisar in western Turkey by Borra, and another panorama of Istanbul by Borra. And I think there are 100 such panoramas known so far in collections in Turkey and England, France, Germany, and Sweden and Holland, and I'm sure there are many more. It's the, yes, possibly the most painted city outline of all. Except maybe Venice. And here is the book they published, they financed themselves, The Ruins of Palmyra or Tadmor in the Desert. And here is an influence of the journey to Palmyra. This is the great house of Stowe outside Aylesbury, the residence of the Marquis of Buckingham, a hugely important Whig lord. And inside Stowe, you have the Garter Room with a ceiling influenced by these prints of Palmyra. So you were nobody if you didn't have a Palmyra ceiling. And it was the state bedroom at the time. So typical, the star of the Order of the Garter surrounded by details from Palmyra. And here is West Wickham, and the owner, Francis Dashwood, had been to the Ottoman Empire in 1735. I'm hoping to make a list of all the travellers and to do a book, and there should be an exhibition about the Grand Tour in the Ottoman Empire. There's been one on the Grand Tour in Italy, not about the Ottoman Empire. So if any of you know of any drawings, please tell me. Drawings or pictures. And here again, there is a Palmyra ceiling in the hall, influenced by Stewart's, by the book of The Ruins of Palmyra by Wood and Dawkins. And here is the entrance wall of Osterley Park, just outside London, West London, again influenced by Wood and Dawkins. And the ceiling in the drawing room is based on the Temple of the Sun at Palmyra. So you see this, it's a great cultural force, the Grand Tour in the Ottoman Empire. And I told you about looking for plants, medicinal plants, that's a whole other book really, but also looking for trees and cedars of Lebanon coming to France and England from travellers in the Ottoman Empire. And here is a, by the way, there are many other ceilings in other English country houses based on Palmyra. Here is a cedar of Lebanon at Paynes Hill in Surrey. And there are many came via Edward Pocock and Richard Pocock. And there are some in the park at Chiswick. But the exact history of the seeds producing the cedars, I don't know. I think there's a society about cedars of Lebanon. So that's the 1750s, and now this is another trip sent by the Society of Dilettanti in 1764 to Athens and to Smyrna to record the antiquities of Ionia, run by Richard Chandler. There was an exhibition 2 years ago at the Soane Museum. The drawings are in the British Museum. And it's very interesting because you see the staff accompanying them, each of which had a different function. And here is Richard Chandler very bravely, it shows Revit, his companion, Nicholas Revit, on the propylaeum of the Athenaeum, drawing it and taking measurements with the machines you then had for taking measurements. And see, they had to bring all their equipment with them. This is at Milas in Turkey. The ladder would have come from Smyrna. They're very brave, very enterprising people. They're risking their lives. The main danger in the Ottoman Empire was plague, which frequently affected people. And here is the rather meditative Mustafa and A'a Bayraktar, they're called, in the temple of Apollo at Didim. So there's extraordinary visual records of these travels. And this is at Milas, October 1764. And this is very interesting, it's showing crossing the river Meander at Milas by Pars, this drawing. And you see that, in fact, most travellers are wearing European dress, standard European dress. And these wooden sort of trays to help you cross the river existed until within living memory as a means of transport.
And Meander disappeared in the meantime. Meander disappeared in the meantime.
And the Meander meanwhile disappeared. It's dried up practically.
Yes. It's all industrial.
And also people were going to Egypt, then a province of the Ottoman Empire. This is from F.L. Norden's Travels in Egypt and Nubia, 1757. He's paid by the King of Denmark. It's not just a French or English phenomenon. Here we are at Luxor. And here is the map of his travels. The Danish Arabia expedition, 1761-7. Only Niebuhr survived. And they had specific instructions to be very polite to everybody. And you see how far they traveled, and they went to Yemen, and then to India, and then back on this overland route via Aleppo. And this is the book, Description of Arabia, Copenhagen, 1773. Paid for by the King of Denmark, because part of your glory as a monarch was to encourage scientific expeditions and culture. And meanwhile, people are even beginning to live or reside for a time in the Ottoman Empire. Everybody's heard of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, but maybe not of her wastrel son, Edward Wortley Montagu. MP, gambling scandal, he decides to leave, and he lives in the Ottoman Empire in Alexandria. He marries an Englishwoman there, living in the Turkish manner, it was said. And he then assists the consul in Egypt as his secretary and assistant. He probably spoke Ottoman Turkish, and then he moves to Venice. And this is him dressed as a Turk in Venice. He sets up shop. It's somewhere to go to in Venice if you're on the Grand Tour, and he's selling Turkish objects, which are very sensible. And this has only just been discovered in a Bond Street, I've only just seen it in a Bond Street gallery. The inscription reads, Edward Wortley Montagu, a noble Englishman, a member of the Royal Society and the Institute of Bonn, a worshipper of science. He visited almost the entire globe and all the peoples therein. He was very well versed in the languages of the East, and but I think he was a bit of a rogue, and his servant came back with him and was buried in Kent. And there's a story there, and particularly that it's an English traveller who is setting up shop selling Ottoman objects in Venice. Why not a Venetian? Or maybe there were Venetians already doing that. You see, what do people want to buy? They want to buy exotic objects like pipes and guns. And here is a view of Smyrna, an anonymous view, the great port where Asia comes shopping for Europe and vice versa, full of Greeks, Armenians, Jews, English, French, Italians, a place for shopping, a place for doctors, a place for shipping your antiquities out to back home. From as early as the 1620s, the English ambassador was shipping antiquities from Smyrna, some of which are now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So the Grand Tour in the Ottoman Empire, there's a huge movement of antiquities to France and England. Perhaps no place, Chandler wrote, has contributed more than Smyrna to enrich the collections and cabinets of the curious in Europe. And one of the most curious and one of the most Philhellene was the Comte de Choiseul-Gouffier, who travels around the Ottoman Empire in 1776. Here he is at Durlak in Anatolia, resting with his party, his escort, and here he is giving presents to the local governor. You can see the presents in a box on the left, some of the presents, particularly watches, of course, were welcome, and many other objects. And you see he's sitting, people were obsessed with rank and so on, he's sitting almost as an equal of the Pasha at the same height on the divan. And the interpreter is in the middle, wearing a bonnet, on his knees in front of the governor, whereas no Western traveller would have willingly agreed to that. In fact, he's already planning the liberation of Greece, or independence of Greece, as some Westerners and some Greeks already were. Greeks particularly dreaming of Russia as an Orthodox power liberating them. And he travels with artists, one of whom is Hilaire. This is a view of Millet by Hilaire, 1776. Here is a view of Istanbul by Hilaire, an extraordinary artist, and I think some of the antiquities in the foreground are going to be shipped back 4 Choiseul-Bouffier from Istanbul. He had an extraordinary collection, and some of them, during the French Revolution, he opposed the revolution. He left his antiquities in Istanbul, and he found them in 1814 again, and they were shipped back, and they're now in the Louvre. And here is another view of Sarajevo, of Palace Point by Hilaire, his artist. He had 2 artists, he had Hilaire and he had Casas. And it will be, this is Hilaire's view of a courtyard of Topkapi Palace. And he's later, this Philhellene is later appointed French ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in 1784. So of course the English draw attention to the Ottoman government that actually he's written a book with a preface saying, oh, when will Greece be freed from intolerable servitude? So it's a huge diplomatic incident. But in practice, as often happens, the Philhellene, the traveling Philhellene, became quite a successful pro-Ottoman ambassador, because there were different roles, and it was in his interest to make a success of it. Although he is said to have incited the Ottoman government to declare war on Russia in 1787, which was another disastrous war with Russia when the Ottoman Empire was defeated. But for our pleasure, he is paying Casas, an extraordinary artist, to go all around the empire, Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. And here I'm going to show you some of his pictures. Some are from the net, some are at the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Tours. Here is the Philopapou monument in Athens. You see the travelers on the right, the Turkish escort on the left. It's very romanticized. But, I mean, together in an exhibition, these would be extraordinary. Here is Athens by Casas. This is 1784 to 6. Here is Ephesus. Here is a profile of Aleppo, now at Tours, with the great citadel. Here is the Dogs River on the coast of Lebanon, where different conquerors left inscriptions saying their armies had passed, which you can still see. Here is Baalbek. This is a very romanticized view of an entrance to the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek, sold at Monaco in 2017. And here is an incredible view of Palmyra. And these are constantly appearing on the market. And here, Casas shows himself visiting and reception of the traveling artist by the chief of the Arabs in Palmyra. And he's offering bottles, 1785. This is in the Wellcome Institute. And here is a view of a meeting of caravans in the Valley of Tombs, the tower tombs of Palmyrines. And there's many more drawings in the Getty Museum in California. And these trips to Syria and knowledge now not only of the Ottoman Empire but even of Bedouin Arabs is becoming so familiar that there was even an opera about them. And I owe this information to my friend Christopher Wentworth Stanley of Vienna. And the opera was put on in Dublin, The Bedouins or the Arabs of the Desert, written by Isles Irwin, who had written a book about his travel across the desert from the Gulf to Aleppo, coming back from India. And it's put on, he wrote an account of his journey. Unfortunately, it's put on in Dublin in 1800, but it only ran for 3 days, and it's never been heard since. So maybe we can revive it. Again, the Grand Tour is becoming part of cultural life in France and England. as well as in the Ottoman Empire. And here is Cassas's view of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, a view of Bela Pace Abbey in Cyprus, one of the first examples I've found of any interest in Crusader architecture. They're obsessed with the classical past to the exclusion of the Christian past and the Crusader past. Here's a very fantasized view of the Sphinx and the pyramid, also a tour. And there was also a Polish grand tour and Russian and German grand tour of the Ottoman Empire. They would come down from Poland through the Black Sea to Istanbul and approach Europe from the Ottoman Empire. This is a famous writer of the time called Jean Potocki by G.B. Lampe, and he wrote a Voyage en Turquie et en Égypte, 1788, famous at the time. You see the pyramids in the background. Already, the pyramids are becoming a sort of stock prop for Western portraitists. And because Cassas had been round the Ottoman Empire, the British ambassador, the rival of Choiseul-Bouffier, Sir Robert Ainslie, had to have his artists going around the Ottoman Empire. And I had a plan with the late great Bryony Llewellyn to do an exhibition of Luigi Meyer's views of the Ottoman Empire. So if anybody wants to help that plan, unfortunately she's no longer with us, please tell me. And he had come from Sicily. He was paid 50 guineas a year by Sir Robert Ainslie, who's also a great coin collector, because people, travellers in the Ottoman Empire, are also collecting coins and intaglios and cameos non-stop. And he meets in Istanbul three travellers, Berners and Graves and Tilney, and they go round in 1792 to 4 round the whole Ottoman Empire. This is a view of the Bosphorus, of Greeks dancing at Tarabya, the Feast of St. John, of the island of Samos, off the coast of Turkey, the temple of Juno at Samos, the caravan bridge at Smyrna, the main bridge where caravans would cross bringing the produce of Anatolia to Smyrna. Ephesus, and experts say he's topographically and archaeologically quite accurate. It would be a wonderful subject for an exhibition, because you have archaeology, topography, the Grand Tour, and English-Turkish relations all in one. You see copying inscriptions, drawing, sculpture. And this is the island of Arwad off Tartus on the coast of Syria. And many English architects are now going to the Ottoman Empire. A, because it's easy. B, because Italy is closed because of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. So among the artists, the architects who went there, there's Smirke, Cockerell, William Wilkins, and Charles Barry. Almost every prominent early 19th century English artist goes to the Ottoman Empire. Here is Phoenician tombs outside Tartus, a view of Jerusalem by Luigi Meyer, and he often did three views of the same place because he's travelling with three English gentlemen and they each want a set of drawings, a token of the expedition. These are Mameluke tombs near what is now called Rashid, which used to be called Rosetta, a great port of Egypt, and showing interest in Islamic architecture. And here's a very interesting sword dance at Giza. So he's interested also in local costumes and customs. And you see one dancer is practically naked. And then he goes back with the British ambassador over the Balkan Mountains. 1794 with Sir Robert Ainsley, and he ends his life in Suffolk giving drawing lessons to local gentry. That's the view. And incorporated even in plates in China. The Luigi Meyer views are then made into prints and books. So Robert Ainsley takes the glory. I think his widow is given some money. And views from these prints are put onto China for the homes of England. You see, this is a Lycian tomb. And here's another view. Here's a book on Constantinople by the chaplain of the embassy. He travels to Troy, and he uses the word tourist in this book. And I wonder if that's the first known use of the word tourist. And then 1796 to 8, a great author, design guru, interior decorator, Thomas Hope, Anglo-Dutch. He goes all round. This is painted when he's returned to England by William Beechey. It's in the National Portrait Gallery. He writes a brilliant Ottoman novel called Anastasius, which I recommend to all of you. And he commissions drawings of his travels, which are now in the Bernarchi Museum in Athens. Travellers halting in Rumeli. Dancing boys, and this is always remarked upon by travellers. Byron's friend Hobhouse said, it was a spectacle which no English gentleman would watch, but he clearly had. And for lookers on the Nile, this is the Capuchin convent in Athens, where Byron later stays in 1809 to 10. These Catholic orders are all over the Ottoman Empire, providing hospitality, information, medicines, and so on. And a fantastic drawing, I'm not sure by whom, of what's called Pompey's column in Alexandria, because Hope is already paying people to go up it. This is before Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. And the Mosque of Jazar Pasha at Acre, that's where Napoleon's army is defeated in 1799. The fountain, Sultan Ahmed's fountain outside the gate of Topkapi Palace, details of Ottoman architecture, the interior of a harem, the summer harem. He could go in when the ladies weren't there. And the a tomb near in Uskudar. He's an extraordinary witness of the Ottoman Empire just before the Greek revolt. Here are drawings by Fauvel, who is an agent for Choiseul Gouffier. He lives in Athens as a consul, and he is a aesthetically Philhellene, but politically pro-Ottoman. He leaves Greece in disgust when it becomes independent, and he dies in Smyrna in 1838. That's the column at Aegina, and this is the Arch of Galerius in Salonika, and this is Fauvel living in Athens before the Greek revolt. And he's constantly buying and selling antiquities with almost everybody, including Elgin, English, French, anybody. This is Edward Dodwell, a view of Athens. 1810, it was always said that half the House of Lords at any one time was in Paris. Well, actually in 1810, half the House of Lords is in Athens. Lord Byron, Lord Sligo, Lord Clare, Lord Aberdeen, later Prime Minister at the time of the Crimean War, and many others. The classic regions of Greece have recently been explored by such a multiplicity of travellers, complained Dodwell, that there is nothing left to say. Wonderful view of the Parthenon. And here is really the hero of the Grand Tour in the Middle East, in the Levant, because Byron and he's so fascinating, so multifaceted, and up to no good, as you would expect. He's theoretically pro-Greek, but he has great friends with Ali Pasha, the governor on the right, governor of southern Albania, who he called the mildest mannered man who ever slit a throat. And then he complains about boyish minions about hallowed love in Ioannina, but in fact he's with a Greek boyfriend, Niccolo. And I have a letter from Niccolo, if I can find it. Anyway, he later dumps Niccolo, but Niccolo wrote to him, and the letter was kept saying, "Oh, if I was a bird, I would fly to my master." But yes, "My most precious master, I cannot describe the grief in my heart at not seeing you for such a long time. Oh, if only I were a bird and could fly so as to come and see you for 1 hour, I would be happy to die at the same time." But he's completely forgotten. And the artist of Baron is by Thomas Phillips. He's brought a magnificent Albanian costume in Greece in order to be painted back in England. And the costume can be seen at Bowood in Wiltshire. He gave it to a friend. But now we have the local reaction to these travellers, that they've been very interested in news and talking and presence. But Ali Pasha is more political because he really wants to found an independent state. He wants to be friends with the English or the French or anybody who's going to help him against the Sultan. That's why Baron gets such a good reception. And Baron may have been, there is one theory, I don't really believe it, that he was sent by the English in Malta to Ioannina in order to seduce Ali Pasha and make him pro-English. And here are Louis Dupre's really wonderful drawings of 1819, Greece just before the Greek War of Independence. On the right is one of Ali Pasha's sons, I think. They later became governors, the grandsons went on being governors in the Ottoman Empire. These are from Karen Taylor. And there's a Turkish imam and a Greek priest in Athens. And Athens was quite relaxed. Athens, with all these wealthy travellers, it is even said that the Athenians opposed Greek independence, as many Greeks did. But this is sort of airbrushed out of the record. And now women are going independently on the grand tour in the Ottoman Empire. And here is a star, Lady Hester Stanhope. She'd been entertaining for her uncle in 10 Downing Street. Her uncle Pitt the Younger said life is a bit flat after that. Therefore she moves to the Ottoman Empire. She travels, she's rich, she's got a doctor with her. 1810, she meets Baron in Athens, and he, of course, makes a caustic comment. A woman, that dangerous thing, a female wit. She had a great disregard of received notions, and he chose not to engage in debate on women's rights, i.e. he was a coward because she might have worsted him, I think. And she's the first, or one of the first travellers, who actually arrives and never leaves, because she eventually goes to Lebanon and settles in a place called June, beautiful place in southern Lebanon, very good climate, and somehow she survives until the 1830s, but dies, the money runs out, she's abandoned by her servants, her doctor leaves, and she dies alone. So there's a moral there. And in fact, people are already laughing at her, and they say, well, one of the most interesting old ruins in the Levant is Lady Hester. But there's another woman, much mocked, who is the Princess of Wales, the estranged wife of the Prince Regent. And she travels all around the Ottoman Empire in 1815 to 16. And interestingly, she was quite radical. She gave money to a Greek cultural society in Athens called the Friends of the Muses, But that may have been a subsidy to Greek independence, who knows. She entered Jerusalem and bought lovely gold brocade dresses, and she founded her own order, the Order of St. Caroline, probably just to annoy her husband. And here's a map of her travels. You see she's going to Egypt, Jerusalem, Turkey, Constantinople, and so on. And now it's really becoming, it's hotting up. Everybody's going to the Ottoman Empire. Here is William Henry Banks, 1820, travelled in Syria and Egypt, 1,500 drawings. He never made a book, but they're all now in Dorchester Museum, History Centre. They're better old drawings of Damascus in Dorset than in Syria. Here is a drawing of a house in Syria, Sanamain. Some of the Egyptian antiquities in his house in Dorset, Kingston Lacey, which are constantly being found in cupboards. And he even brought back an obelisk from Philae, erected in 1830 with the help of soldiers. And George IV supplied the granite base, Wellington supplied the soldiers. So it's a sort of group English effort commemorating a grand tour in the Ottoman Empire. And here is a view by Cecile and Balzac of Karnak in Egypt. And here Champollion, the decipherer of the hieroglyphs, finally makes it to the Ottoman Empire. And I included this because it shows sunglasses, some early sunglasses, 1828. And this is Thomas Lee, an English gentleman who goes all around Egypt and Jordan. He's known in the Ottoman Empire as Osman, and I think he's parodied by William Thackeray in a novel as Mr. Bedouin Sands, because he's always talking about his travels. And you see this wonderful picture by William Bradley. It hangs in a pride of place in the hall of his house, Lyne Park, outside Manchester. And he brings back antiquities. I think these are casts of panels from Athens, hanging in a hallway. Because you had to bring back trophies of your travels. And here is this is Charles Lennox Coming, Bruce, by Andrew Geddes in front of Bulbeck. And later he's an MP. This is of Irby and Mangles, who go all over Egypt. They explored Abu Simbel, they crossed the desert along the coast, they went to Baalbek, Aleppo, and so on, always meeting other travellers on the way. Because Muhammad Ali, the modernizing governor of Egypt, is also equally keen to get English and French support for his independence from the Ottoman Empire, to make it as easy as possible for travellers and for travellers to export antiquities. This is the Comte de Forbin, the head of the Louvre, who is in Egypt. He's the figure in the turban leaning against the Sphinx. And of course he's the head of the Louvre, he's trying to get antiquities to fill up the gaps left after the fall of Napoleon. This is another French traveller, Alexandre de Laborde. This isn't a Turkish gentleman, it's a French traveller. Wrote a wonderful book about it. That's his son, who later also is head of the Louvre. This is the travel book, Interest in Ottoman Tombs in Bursa. This is another source of travellers. This is a ship's captain's logbook, or the sort of, because naval officers were trained to give very accurate drawings. And now David Roberts is going around 1839. These are huge commercial success. Everybody had prints from Roberts's books. And He gets Petra, which has just been discovered, and here he is. And this is the real reason why it's so easy, the struggle between Muhammad Ali Pasha on the left and Abdul Majid on the right, 1839 by David Wilkie, another travelling artist in the Ottoman Empire. It's an epic struggle which almost ends in a world war. But mercifully, France was supporting Muhammad Ali. France backs off. Every other power is supporting the Ottoman Empire. And 1840, from this date, you have the beginning of the vast reform program of the Ottoman Empire, assisted by many foreigners in Ottoman service, in the army, the navy, government departments, and so on. And now I really must end, but I would like to conclude, and of course this is now the age of mass tourism with steamers taking travellers east. I'll conclude with a quote from Anthony Trollope, his novel Frank Thorne, published in 1858, describing people after Oxford or Cambridge, doing the fashionable things, going up the Nile, crossing over to Mount Sinai, thence over the long desert to Jerusalem, and home by Damascus, Beirut, and Constantinople, bringing back a long beard, a red cap, and a chibuk, just as our fathers used to go through Italy and Switzerland, and our grandfathers to spend a season in Paris. In other words, the Grand Tour of the Ottoman Empire had become familiar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for this marvellous overview and such beautiful pictures.
Thank you.
I'm sure there was something original there for every reader. So who would like to ask a question to our speaker? First person. Well, one obvious but interesting thing is that this feeling was to such a large extent reciprocated from the Ottoman side. One could argue that they were westernising almost from the point of their foundation.
There's very little curiosity to begin with, and partly we must remember there were no mosques in the West. They were banned, although theoretically France should have allowed mosques to be established because it had a treaty with the Ottomans. There's a massive interest after 1830, or even before 1830's beginning, and the Turkish obsession with Paris is a whole subject on its own. Well, some young Turks talk about Paris, the light comes from Paris, it's greater than Mecca, and they actually write this. And then the obsession with being, he was studying in France and Italy, and to a lesser extent, Vienna. And then importing French words into the Turkish language. So long before Atatürk's language reform, there's 4,000 French words in Turkish.
And many of them are still there today. So it's really quite
Yeah.
extraordinary. One suddenly realises when speaking a French word in Turkish.
And by the latter part of the 19th century, the Turkish Foreign Office was writing to itself in French. Its dispatches from between Constantinople and the ambassadors were in French and not Turkish.
But the only real Turkish traveller we know of is Evliya Çelebi, who does get to Vienna. But I'm not a fan of his, actually.
It's not so much travelling, is it? It's the cultural influence and where they want to get to as an empire. Because
Yeah.
they're not particularly curious about the Arab lands, as far as I can see. I mean, they go
No.
there, but it's hot, it's nasty. They don't like the Arabs. Anyway, I mean, that's a very old truth. But on the other hand, they've got the chance to think about Western things.
Yeah. They're interested in weapons, anchors for the ships, guns for the army, and techniques. But again, the West is more curious. There's somewhere lost, there are Van Moor pictures of fishing techniques on the Bosphorus commissioned by the French Minister of Navy. And of course, coffee and so on.
Carpet.
Yeah.
Yes. You didn't talk much about book collections in your talk, but that appears to me equally fundamental.
Yeah.
Because in particular, as you get the later collecting, so the Blackmare catalogue is surely the most extraordinary example of collecting these things and putting them together, for then a kind of to build an ancient Athenian life in the footholds of the Parthenon.
And then the whole thing of Turkish rooms
Yes.
in Western castles and chateaux and palaces. But that's a whole other subject.
Yes. Have you discovered many discrete book collections other than the Blackmare one in your researches?
Yes, well, the Ömer Koç's book collection is incredible.
Yes.
And there were other collections, like Blackmare, Atabey, and others. So sometimes you see in catalogues the magic phrase, not in Blackmare. I got something Blackmare didn't have.
Yeah.
Right.
But I can't remember the names. I think a lot of Greeks in the 20th century collected books about the Ottoman Empire, and their collections are some are in private hands in Athens.
Yes. Well, certainly the Blackmare sale was one of the great events in the history of book sales in London. It
Oh, really?
Really absolute frenzy. And just before the internet, of course, so that would be what, 1988, was it? See, what happened was that the catalogue began to be sent around, and governments began to be interested.
Yeah.
So they didn't really have to say no that they could just get many of these things that if they needed to, and so instead they got government budgets to bid out the sale.
Wow.
So the prices that were reached were absolutely extraordinary. So you've got the Turks buying for their national library, you've got the Greeks buying for theirs, you've got collectors from all the world all coming together, all centered around this one collection.
Wow.
It's a remarkable phenomenon.
Recording in progress.
Selling books just of the sort that you were illustrating here, giving them a whole new kind of lease in cultural
I
reinvention.
once asked a friend or somebody who'd known Blackmare, did he read all those books? And the answer was, I wouldn't go that far.
The rate he was buying them, he wouldn't have had time to do something. But what he was trying to do, of course, was recreate the lifestyle.
Oh, really?
Well, the point is that he bought an Ottoman Greek house in the foothills of the Parthenon, and then he proceeded to invest the money that he got from his father, who was a banker. He wasn't a particularly wealthy man, but books were cheaper in those days.
Yes.
Yeah, not at all. And the spare money he would buy him his books, flooding in from all over the place in crates. And then he built himself a kind of a mock Ottoman house in 20th century Athens.
What's happened to it?
Well, the books were all sold off.
Yes, but the house.
The house itself, well, I imagine it's just become an hotel like anything else or something like that, or fallen down or being built over. I mean, it was more, I think, the way that the aesthetic that he was looking at was being recreated by him.
Wow. Was there an article about his house? There must have been.
Yeah, well, you can find, I mean, there are two catalogues. There's the Sotheby's catalogue, and there's the other one, the name I always forget, but it's the one that was commissioned by the collection itself after he died. Subbers or something like that. So there might be more about it in the catalogue that's actually done for the private edition that they produced at the time. But they're certainly both, although you probably need to get the private one in the library somewhere, they're both pretty available. I mean, the Blackmare one, of course, is available in the trade. And I've also been greatly puzzled about the Schwarzenegger book, because that's an absolute elephant, really.
Yes.
I mean, you remember that it must weigh, 12 kilos easily.
Yes.
And yet it's not terribly sought after, and I've always been puzzled why Schwarzenegger's production should not be regarded as being as important as Robert's. I don't know whether that's struck you at all.
I'm amazed. I didn't know that. It's very, very important, and I think maybe because there's been no proper book on him, and no proper book on his cultural patronage, because he has everybody around him, and I think he's paying himself, not the French government. He's less well known.
It's also less well focused, I suppose, because in travelling he comes up through the Greek islands.
Yes.
So you've got to go through an awful lot of material before you get to the key point. Might be that.
And very focused on the classical past.
Yes. Yes, maybe he wasn't being sufficiently romantic. I really don't know.
Don't you think the lithography probably made it much easier?
Sorry?
Lithography made it much easier for Roberts to be doing this.
Yes.
Printing.
I think that's the key. And lithography is, I think Maya is one of the first ones.
Yeah. And it really gets going in the 1820s. And so it's cheap and it's very
cheap.
efficient.
Yeah.
Means of transportation of the time that you come from Trieste or from Italy when they come through Athens and
Through Athens and the islands.
and then Rhodes and Smyrna and then go up to this will be boats, I guess, and then they will go on the horses or camels.
Where?
And then they would go on the land with horses or camels. How would they do?
Yes,
What would they?
Horses.
Yeah.
But preferring boat where they could, as is more comfortable. In fact, there is another Lady Craven, who comes down through Russia and stays with Shazar Gouffier in Istanbul. And there's much more material. It will, I hope, be a book. People from the 1790s, travelling gentlemen, are staying in Turkish farms. That's JBS Morit from Rugby. And then the sexual side of the travel is, as Westerners always say, they can find women more easily in Istanbul and on the Greek islands. And there's a legal system called cabin, mariage à la cabine in French.
Yes.
Yes. And from the 16th century, it's signed by a Kader even, isn't it?
Yeah.
Has anybody written about it in
There
Turkey?
is a first Turkish novel which is actually written in Greek alphabet and in Turkish. Seyreyle Dünyayı in Turkish name, which means it's very much of a big book, a whole description of the lifestyle all through Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
Some Greek origin or specific Romeos needed to call them, person who was born in Izmir and then become a publisher himself and then moved to Istanbul. And there is a whole story there that you could see the life of single woman, harem, and then what happens to, just like in Loti, there's a whole system of supporting themselves and nightlife and all that. So it's quite.
But on the islands, there's another traveller called Lord Chalmont. I didn't have time to mention. He talks about in the 1750s, I think, dealing with the mothers would sell their daughters to English travellers for a few weeks or something. Yes.
These travelers, how did they find places to stay during all these tours? Was there any agent or places that?
There were the convent in Athens. They would stay in inns in Beyoğlu near the embassies, which were already existing, and then they would stay in khans in Anatolia, or in tents in which the staff would put up, but always with the knowledge of the local governor, I think. But it's a very good question. Or they would stay on their boats as they're drifting round. Where Thomas Hope stayed in Cairo, I have no idea.
Do they have any papers to?
They don't normally talk about the hotels. I think local Christians run.
And consulars, no consulars. For example, in case of Byron, he stayed with consulars.
Or with consuls, yes. Consuls would be very hospitable. It was part of their job to be hospitable to travellers.
So you have to remember that they were never travelling alone. They would always have a Yenicheri with them, absolutely axiomatically. And it was the job of the Yenicheri, you see, when they reached the settlement, to find them somewhere to stay. So you have to picture them going across Anatolia, if they've got a bit out of Istanbul, you see, and they're arriving somewhere, it's getting dark. Okay, what do? Well, the electuary goes along, finds the local village head, and says, right, my lord needs somewhere to stay. Any protest, a quick bash over the head with the flat of the sword, soon reaps dividends. And so then they would have to find a room somewhere, and then whatever food that the village could rustle up would be brought out for them, in return for which they'd have to pay.
Yeah.
And so there would be some kind of negotiation taking place, and no doubt some were mercilessly ripped off, some of them were more reasonable, and some of them paid properly, some of them didn't, and so on. But this negotiation was always a tripartite one. It was always the local people, the representatives of Ottoman state, and the travellers. And the job of the emissionary was a very interesting one, but they had to balance, you see. They had to make sure that they were supporting the Turkish side and their own pockets, but at the same time they couldn't afford for there to be any public fuss. They had to make sure that they didn't get killed, they had to make sure that they didn't get poisoned, they had to make sure they didn't get robbed, because that would get them into trouble. And so there was a great incentive for them to act really as chaperones, and it meant that there was quite a lot of flexibility to move around Anatolia, providing that you were properly sorted out within this entourage framework. And there are multiple different ways that you have to get these different classes from different places you have to go.
How did they travel? On horseback?
Oh yes, of course.
On coaches?
Yes, on horseback.
No
of course.
coaches.
Yes, no roads, horseback, if you're in that far, yes. So, yeah. And there would be, of course, stages of horses as well.
Yeah.
It was also the other ones to get sent back, and then it would be part of the job of the janitary to find you more horses, you see, or to tell the governor that you required more horses, and so on and so on and so on.
Yes.
How did you get the job of being the janissary to the wealthy traveller? They must have been select.
Well, they by the consulate, you see, because janitharies worked with specific consulates.
Yes.
And so there would have been somebody whom the English consulate knew who was quite good at looking after British travellers, and then their families in turn would get passed on the job, and they would have friends. So it was a network, a chain network.
What did they say it was kavas, or was kavas a bit different? Kavas being like the guard.
Well, there were
I think
people
it
have
was
different
a
roles.
station.
Yeah, yes, they're different roles, and you just think in terms of having to pass through different checkpoints all the time. I mean, you have to pay even to move from one side of the Bosphorus to another. You have there's these things changed at different times, but wherever you went, you'd have to be prepared to spend something. So you would have to have quite deep pockets to be able to
Yes.
travel.
It was expensive. You had to be quite rich. One of the common factors of these travellers is they're well off. Very.
Later, well, what you've just described, later in the 19th century, that soldier Burnaby wrote a very boring book actually, but entirely describing what you said about how he worked with the people he paid to get all across Anatolia on horseback, camping, setting up camp, being cheated, not being cheated, etc. So, but I mean, he was not a rich man, and it's later, it's after this period even. Sort of with but on horseback through Anatolia or something as this.
He was very proud of that book. He would be very upset to hear you thought that it wasn't.
Well, it was very repetitive because essentially it was the same thing over and over and over, but it very much explained what you've just said. It entirely explained.
It's a so complete system.
Yes, and he was just a single soldier, but he had the whole support system paid for by him, and he did it, regularly. But through Anatolia on horseback is one of the trips.
Sorry, we're talking about all these male travelers. What about all the women? The Digby, the Hester. I mean, that's even more fascinating. How these women traverse the land.
Hester Sullivan had Dr. Merriam and servants with her, and she made the life of the English consul in Aleppo very difficult because of her demands and imperious manner. And the Princess of Wales, I don't know who organised her travel, but she would have had male servants, senior servants.
Yes, and some of them were women who'd fallen out with their husbands. I think this is quite a pattern. Certainly my memory is that Craven, you see, she had some kind of we know much about Craven because of letters she was exchanging with her lover, having become estranged from her husband, and then she married again. I may be slightly making it up, but I've got a very strong memory that that's how it works out.
But Jane Digby went from husband to husband. I think that's how she traveled.
Yes, well, that's also it's a well-known, particularly American way of doing things, isn't it? Yes.
And she was well off too, I think. She must have been.
But it's very interesting you should mention Roberts, because I've got a distinct idea that by the time you get to Roberts, we've really got the beginning of the fascination for the Arabs happening.
Yes.
I reckon. There seems to be a sea change.
Yes.
What do you think?
I think you're right, and it's to do with Muhammad Ali and Egypt being much more easy and better run for travellers, and Muhammad Ali or his son actually half appealing to Arabs. So the feeling that this area is becoming much more interesting and might be detached from the empire.
But it was also after Napoleon and later the publication of all those drawings and descriptions in Egypt, and that opened up the Arab world as well.
But
And the Arabs didn't like it very much, having guides from Jerusalem or Egypt coming and descending on Petra and taking all the travellers' money, and they got nothing.
Yeah.
Any more questions, please?
What was the money used? Gold coins? Which countries? What was the common?
It's Maria Theresa thalers often, and different currencies. On the whole, Ottoman currency wasn't much trusted, I think, actors and so on, because there was light. Maybe there's somebody here who's better informed about currency than I am. You could have letters of change, and they would be honoured in Aleppo or Izmir.
That's how the Templars did it, wasn't it?
Hmm?
That's how the Templars did it. The Knights of the St. John's Temple.
Yeah.
That's how they organised it.
I've always been wondering about that. The commission one must have paid to change money must have been absolutely fantastic. I can't believe it was like 1%. I mean, people must have been making 20 or 30% to change money. I think about it, because the person offering the money had to provide the money somewhere, like say in Smyrna, and then they had to somehow they get the money from the British bank on which this letter of exchange was offered. And there must have been that mechanism. I don't know if anybody knows about how the bills of exchange function within the financial system in the 18th and 19th century.
You probably would trade with the money, you wouldn't exchange it to a bank. So the exchange person would be also a trader. He would get pounds or francs or whatever, and then buy from France and Britain and then bring it. So your early bankers were also traders.
Yeah.
Yes, but if you've got a letter of credit, so the letter of credit says something like, this is to guarantee that the bank in London will give 100 gold.
Yes.
So you take that to Egypt and you offer this letter.
Yes.
And you give the other side the letter.
Yes.
So they can then use that. They can trade that letter.
What they can do is have an account in Europe at one point in which the money can be paid, because your traders in Smyrna or your traders in Alexandria had also accounts in Europe.
So it was a bit like the American travelers' checks of today.
It's actually people who were bankers at the same time as being traders.
And I think it was set up by the Templars.
Yes, but I'm just thinking then, how do you?
Knights.
So your letter of credit, though, you've then got to send it by courier all the way to the bank.
Say to Paris or London or wherever.
And if it gets lost on the way, you've lost
It's
your
a
money.
problem. Yes, it's a problem.
So that's what I was thinking about the exchange rate. They must have been taking at least 30%.
I agree
themselves.
that wasn't a quarter of a percent.
Yeah, like you get today, yeah. But please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that they were called correspondent banks for that reason, in that you wouldn't send the actual letter of credit.
Recording
You send
in
a letter
progress.
saying to your bank in London, please deposit this or establish that credit. And it's a system. When I was a banker up to 20 years ago, we still call them correspondent banks, and that's how it still works with letters of credit.
So these were early checks in effect, no?
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
They're all based on a system of trust.
But they were effectively negotiable because you could discount them.
Yeah, you could
Yes,
say
that's
you-
what I
you
meant.
went on
Discount
to
somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you could, so in fact you could get a bit of profit there maybe. If you cash it in at a 30% commission, and you find someone that can give you just a small profit, like 3 or 4% profit, who's going that way anyway,
Yeah.
you might be able to cash in your investment immediately. Yeah.
It's the same system that you had in Italy early on,
Right.
that they moved to Constantinople first and then to the rest of the Middle East, you know. The bankers were there, you know.
Yes.
The Medicis were bankers. That's how they made their money, you know.
From the mid-1850s, I know that's slightly later, you had the Imperial Ottoman Bank, which had branches in Alexandria and Cyprus and right around the Middle East. You know.
Well, then you've got the telegraph, haven't you, already?
Yes.
So
It's
I
the
don't know whether they-
60s, yes.
I don't know whether they use the telegraphs for financial transactions, but the post even then must be much quicker by now anyway.
Yeah, telegraph was used.
It was,
Yeah. And then it was the telex and the casted telex, and that's, you know, just moved with the technology, you know, especially.
yes, indeed.
And that's why really your bankers were at the origin traders.
Yeah.
You know, that's really how bankers became bankers. They first were traders and then they moved to banking. And then they abandoned trading because banking is a lot more profitable.
Yes.
And also kind of like the issues of usury.
Yes.
So that's partly where Venice comes in, as being right in between the two.
Absolutely. That's they
Started
started.
geographically, and Italy as well.
The Ottomans used Greek bankers often.
The Flemish and Italians ruled, they were using textiles to cover up the profits they're making in banking. Because they couldn't be seen to be making money out of money.
Well, that's still an idea. Apparently he used citrus fruits to cover up his operations. So, that's definitely ways of doing it. I wonder how much you can leave Italy out of the story. You know, isn't there quite a strong link there? As people are traveling, can you leave Italy out of the story?
No, not
completely?
at all. It's all you meet your courier in Naples or Venice or wherever.
Yeah.
And that's where the Leotard meets Punts and Beer and Sandwich. And a lot of these travel books, it's sort of travels to Venice, Sicily and Turkey, as if it's a natural progression.
Please.
Obviously much later, a lot of the travel was for religious reasons, the Bible lands,
Yes.
translating the Bible, the missionaries and so on. These earlier travels, 18th century, 19th century, even you started at the end of the 17th century, it was purely cultural. There seems to have been
I'm
no
always
religious
amazed
dimension
at
at
the
all.
absence of references
Yes.
to Christianity. Yes. Chateaubriand in 1806, he's a pilgrim. But I think he's one of the first modern ones.
Yeah,
And the Mondrel's famous travel book, Aleppo to Jerusalem, he did to go there for Easter. So there are constant Easter pilgrims, Catholics and Protestant and Orthodox. But they're
They're
not
staying
writing.
straight there and back.
not writing books.
Oh, okay.
They're going straight to the Holy Land. I mean, there are
Yeah,
lots and
yeah.
lots of
They're
accounts in the
touring
16th and
through,
17th
meandering
century.
through.
They're not doing, they're just going there. My visit to the Holy Land, and some very early ones, some 16th century English ones, pamphlets on this area with quite a lot of stories about how difficult it was for them to get there. But yeah,
They
very
were poor, they
focused.
were much poorer people, so it was a hard thing. But these rich people, totally uninterested in anything
Yes.
but the culture.
Yep.
Well, just as our speaker said, they vary a lot in quality. These books, some of them are absolutely fascinating, and one can read them all almost today with great pleasure and interest, and other ones really look like they're just done by going through the motions.
And copying other people, copying their predecessors often.
Yes. We didn't talk about books generated for other reasons, but Rico, for example, is a historian of the most fantastic interest, and it kind of overlaps with some of the considerations we're talking about here. But one could almost read Rico today for getting interesting insights into Turkish society, certainly into Ottoman society.
Yeah. But that's another talk about diplomats.
Yes, that is a bit different. But what about What about the people who are actually living there? The consuls and the missionaries, they're all writing later, are there any of the early ones writing?
I think they're very, very busy. The Catholic missionaries write letters back to their superiors in Rome, and they're very descriptive, but mainly about their own concerns, more than the country. And the consuls was overwhelmed by business, I think, and dealing with travellers and dealing with day-to-day events.
Yes. There's also the point that 18th century British publishing was largely, not entirely, but largely predicated around country house and country house libraries. So there's actually an incentive for people from that kind of background to generate a new book to go into their libraries.
Yep. Alexander Drummond, the consul in Aleppo, writes a travel book. I can't think of many others who do.
Yes. A bit later, of course, there were more. Later part of the 19th century.
Yeah.
I thought the Regent himself, of course, was a consul, wasn't he? But what about the colleagues online? If you have any questions, this is now your chance. How do we access you? You can send in a text, which Craig, I'm sure, can field, or if I can't see it here. Or you can just put your hand up, and we'll see if we can connect you. What do you think?
So a light question for you,
yes.
A modern. So when you go to Istanbul yourself and you visit, what do you visit in Istanbul? How do you spend your time?
I'm interested in the political and diplomatic history. I go to museums, I see exhibitions, I try and see the monuments I haven't seen.
Are there still?
Yes, many. I never properly, fully explored everything in Aleppo. And what I find is that the museums are constantly improving, much better, and the palaces, and you can see more and more, except for Yildiz, which has now been taken over by the new Sultan. You can't see the parts of Yildiz, it's completely blocked. And there was a complete Istanbul City Museum there, and other museums. There was the wonderful theatre of Abdul Hamid, you could no longer see it.
But they kind of open more and more Balat and that area. So it's really much more accessible, and there's new, for example, the Bulgarian church made only from metal.
Yes.
So they open that area, and so that area is much more. It's really. I mean, it's really sort of coming out. So it's a very weird.
Have you come across any remarks or information about bathing or other facilities where they stay?
Not much. I imagine some of them went to hammams, but they don't on the whole. They do later, but not in the 18th century that I can think of immediately. There's amazing descriptions of hammams by Bayard Taylor in Aleppo in the 1860s. Bathing, well, of course, Byron swims in the sea. He's very proud of his swimming ability. That's really unusual. That's about it.
Lady Mary describes the ladies' hammam. That's one of the striking parts of her book, I think.
Yes.
The Turkish letters. But you're right, I can't think of any descriptions of other hammams from any male.
But bathing outside, I think the German tourists going to Ottoman Greece began to...
Recording stopped.
When they began to be interested in exploring the pagan side of Greece, then the German homosexuals bathing outside.
Yeah.
There's this new cult of youth and idleness and so on. Yes, I went to a seminar about it once, yes.
And it's Sicily too.
Exactly, yes. Any more points from our colleagues online? You're most welcome if you would like to say anything.
I just add about the money that was used. I think in the 16th century we're talking of Venetian ducat and its equivalents, florins. As someone said, that the Ottoman currency it was called a gurush altın, so gold coin, was not really favoured even by the locals. I think in the 17th century we're talking about silver dollars, typically pesos from Mexico, so Spanish pieces of 8 real and Dutch lion dollars, gurushi aslan, and various other sort of crown, let's say the English crown equivalent for it. But then, of course, towards the end of the very end of the 18th century, then we have the Maria Theresa dollar or tar that was mentioned, which I think then carried on the general trade throughout most of the 19th century in this period, especially in the eastern part, in the Levant, in Yemen, for example. Yeah, so I think as a rule, there usually was a sort of dollar equivalent, but as specie, as gold or silver coin through most of the period that we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think they like Spanish coins, yes, because they were reliable.
I've always found, when looking at these things in a whole, this phenomenon in a whole, I've always found it a very powerful anti-Saidian argument.
Yes.
You remember, of course...
Well, he leaves out political history.
Well, exactly.
And the fact that England and France were supporting the Ottoman Empire almost the whole time. Yeah. And later Austria in the 19th century is pro-Ottoman because they said we will survive or fall together. And Said has a rather Egyptian view, I think. He leaves out the tremendous support for the Ottomans, and then the way later in the 19th century the Ottoman Empire folded into the ceremonial and court and diplomatic system of Europe.
Exactly. So I find it absolutely
it had always been
fascinating.
part of it, I think.
Well, when does the Ottoman Empire began to become explicitly represented in the Almanach de Gotha? When did it start? Right from the early issues?
Pass.
Because certainly in the later issues, they're given full coverage. Very much did this. X is happening. Y. In other words, they're part of the diplomatic court circles of Europe.
And then modern palaces from beginning in 1800, and then various changes of etiquette, and the Sultan hands in the Empress Eugenie to dinner in 1869 in front of his Ottoman courtiers, and then 1878 on, Abdulhamid leads quite a Western life in Yildiz, and he drinks alcohol, but maybe not in front of other people. And he has Verdi operas in his palace theatre. Abdulmejid, his father, had always patronized Italian opera. And his father too, I think.
But what about the eclecticism of the British collecting tradition? You see, because the reason this is so terribly important is what they're not doing is collecting it for nationalist purposes.
Yes, I agree.
And so what we've got here is actually, I think, a very liberal form of cultural cosmopolitanism emerging here. But
cultural cosmopolitanism until the brutal underlying force balance shows itself, as in the British bombardment of Alexandria in 1882, or the French invasion of Egypt in 1798. Then, that's an example of very cultivated people. Actually, they are helping imperialism, and they are helping all the savant with Napoleon. And then they switch suddenly into being pro-Muhammad Ali and pro-independent Egypt. I think you could collect Ottoman art and be anti-Ottoman.
Yes.
And any shades of behaviour were possible.
Yes, which is the opposite, for example, of what happened in the Soviet Union, where any connection with Westernism could get you into an awful lot of trouble, could put you straight into their camps.
Yep. But I'm always amazed at the lack of Ottoman collections in Venice, which has been in touch with the Ottoman Empire forever.
But what about the Vatican? The Pope, surely they've got very good Oriental collections in the Vatican.
Do you?
Think about it again. But maybe.
Maybe for the Venetians it wasn't exotic enough because they were in contact with it all the time.
I've asked our friend in Venice about this, and that was her answer.
It seems, it's just normal, for the West, especially the Brits and the Danish. It's just so exotic. It's so interesting. They haven't been trading with them non-stop for centuries. I'd hazard that as a possible explanation.
Another practical side to their lives during these travels. Did they complain about what they ate? Was it agreeable with them?
Yes, no, they didn't like it. They didn't like it.
Was there any?
Some aspects of Turkish food they liked, but on the whole they complained about the meat.
Horse meat
They didn't like it at all. But Avia in Aleppo likes the variety of food in Aleppo and is quite complimentary. But Aleppo is very, very sophisticated compared to other places. They are very rude and often about the food served by the Grand Vizier at the presentation to the Sultan. Every ambassador has a breakfast and they're pretty rude about it.
They wouldn't have refused baklava in Damascus, probably.
Well, maybe somebody should write a history of baklava. Views of baklava.
We're almost out of time, we have to stop at 8, but very briefly, do you want to talk about these books, just the last minute before we close?
Yes, and these are all books I wrote in the last 30 years, if anybody wants them, on Aleppo, on Izmir, Beirut and Alexandria, and old photographs of the royal families of the Middle East, and on the Ottoman Empire, the great friend Louis XIV. And the reading the dispatches of the French ambassador, Louis XIV's ambassador in Istanbul, it's the amazing amount of intermediaries, priests, travellers, merchants. There's a whole system linking France and the Ottoman Empire. It's too big to fail, so everybody's got a slice of the cake, really. Priests, Marseille, that's a whole other subject. So even when Louis XIV is being aggressive or helping the Venetians or something, the relationship goes on. So the marriage survived many infidelities.
Well, thank you very much to our speaker.